What is up, nerds? This is Trip. Are you ready for some Game of Thrones action? Are you ready to encounter Anthony Le Donne, professor at United Theological Seminary and, co-author of The Gods of Thrones, Volume 1 and 2. And we're going to talk about Game of Thrones. We're going to talk about some Lord of the Rings. We're going to talk about the historical Jesus. We're going to get all over the place, but really, this is two nerds of multiple varieties talking. So I don't even want to have a long intro because Anthony and I talked for a while. I'm not joking. I mean, I'm not sure. You're probably not surprised. You listen to Homebrewed Christianity. They can be as long as I can keep a scholar interesting and on the phone with me. But this is a fun one. I hope you enjoy it. And head over to the website, tripfuller.com, trip with 2 P's, or homebrewedchristianity.com. They go the same place now. All right? We're really updating the website. Next week, I got exciting things to tell you, or maybe on Easter. We talked about telling you on Easter. Anyway, very soon, I'm going to tell you about some new exciting stuff on the website. But you should go over there because, that's how you can subscribe to the podcast or do it on whatever app you use. You can, get one of my books. Go click on the book thing on the website, and you can see all the books of the Homebrewed Christianity series. And check out previous podcasts, like the one right before this, where Aaron from Bald Move Podcast, co-author with Anthony about this book, was on. Those are some amazing options. But most importantly, tell your friends, this is the last invitation you need, right? The last lure you need to really hop on. Get your Game of Thrones up to date for the new season that starts this very month. Okay? All right. Just do it. Just do it. It's going to be wonderful. Theology nerds all over the world. It's okay to come out of the closet and say you love some Game of Thrones. It is. It's excellent. Excellent story. Excellent books. Excellent TV. And we're about to try to lure you into that reality. All right? Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and Anthony Le Donne is on the podcast talking about, get ready, Game of Thrones. He has written 2 volumes, Gods of Thrones, Pilgrim's Guide to the Religions of Ice and Fire, a New Testament scholar partnering with a legendary Game of Thrones podcaster to write the books. So, clearly, that is all the justification I need to get a little nerdy and nerd culture on this episode of the podcast. So, Anthony, thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Trip. So, I'm guessing because you asked, you're something of a Game of Thrones fan. Is that right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I've taught a Game of Thrones class for undergrad students before.
Did you really? Tell me about the. I know I'm not supposed to interview you, but tell me.
Do whatever you want.
I'm curious about your class.
So it was on secular apocalypse narratives, and we use Game of Thrones and Walking Dead, and I've done it with Battlestar Galactica, where you look at how culturally we'll ask apocalyptic narratives, but outside the context of some shared mythic story that you get in, say, Lord of the Rings. If you're drawing Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones contrast, there's you have a eucatastrophes there.
That's right.
Apocalyptic scenarios. And
now, for those people who don't understand, who don't know the term, can you explain eucatastrophe? See, I think I will just interview you today. That's okay.
Just that that when you look at Lord of the Rings, think of all the times the eagles show up. Yeah. Right? There's so many different situations. Bilbo and all the dwarves are up in the tree, and they're surrounded by goblins, or saving Frodo and Sam at the end, or getting Gandalf away from Saruman. A eucatastrophe has all these places where it gets good and evil or locked in this battle, and it's so gonna go down. But what you discover is that the universe you're operating in is one where the sacred is sovereign, and part of, and you can see eucatastrophe express the piety of it in if you read like Civil War stuff on generals on both sides, where they're committed to the fight and all this kind of things, but they know there's this bigger purpose at play. Or you can listen to Gandalf explaining to Frodo how Gollum has a role to play and everyone has their part in the story or whatever, which is the opposite in Games of Thrones, where you're like, get attached to a character, then you find out they're horrible or they lose their head, right? Like Game of Thrones seems to me like if you took like everything you dug about J.R.R. Tolkien and then we're like, now all the beauty and goodness and values and characters in that, what if we assassinated it but kept all the cool fights and stuff, and you stick sex in because Tolkien didn't have sex.
Because you need that human element, right? But I have a little different take on that. But I for people that might not know, Tolkien took two words and smashed them together. That being the word for Eucharist, which is where we get the euch part of that word, and then catastrophe. And that's where we get the word eucatastrophe.
That's catchy.
Yeah. And I think he was kind of before his time with doing that kind of thing. But I see Game of Thrones a little differently because I think you're probably right. If let's say Tolkien's idea was, okay, well, Aragorn is this sort of supernaturally awesome king, like in a way that no one else could be king, and he's going to reign for 100 years or whatever, and the kingdom will be fantastic because you have a fantastic king
with great hair,
with unbelievable hair, which is important, by the way, and which is why I could never be king. But let's take that character and put him in Game of Thrones. Well, he died. Clearly, that character is going to get beheaded. That character is not going to survive. But it's more complex, I think, in that what Martin will do, George R. R. Martin will do, is he'll take this villainous character like Saruman, and then he'll put him on this weird road to redemption over the course of 3 books, where like, no, I'm pretty sure he's evil. Yeah, I mean, everything in the story has taught me to believe he's evil, and now all of a sudden I'm feeling empathy for him, and he's actually acting in ways that are sort of messy gray humanity. And I think Martin is actually really brilliant at doing something like that.
Well, and I think he, you could say, shrinks the horizon for kind of virtue and morality down to the individual. Where then this road to redemption has to do with little moments where this character decides to be something other than the perverse power-seeking Game of Thrones. And so, like, Jaime, you start to have a different relationship with, but because he starts to break character in these little places. But if you take a step back, he's still in the game. But it's like if you just approach, like, or the Hound or someone like that, where you see their resistance to the role they've earned for themselves in the game,
right?
And so you start to have this, excitement for that. And he does just stick characters on there that are so vile. You're like, well, you've only slaughtered a couple thousand people, and you didn't torture anyone and remove their testicles. So, like, I just feel like you've taken some baby steps in the right way.
Well, and let's say we put those two characters together, and we have a character that's clearly a bad person, but then we torture them to such an extent that it's impossible not to feel bad for that person.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's about putting a bad person in the same room with someone who's, the epitome of evil on earth.
Oh yeah. So when was it that you first got into the Game of Thrones? Like when did you go, oh, this is sweet?
Well, I'm like a lot of people. I started watching the HBO show and kind of realized that this is actually scratching an itch that a lot of fantasy literature cannot scratch. I think a lot of fantasy lit is kind of embarrassingly written. The characters aren't developed. The dialogue isn't, it's really one dimensional. But I mean, I think I realized early on with Game of Thrones that this has some significant complexity, even if you're not a fantasy nerd. I am. And so then when I started watching the first season on HBO, I thought, well, I gotta pick up the books, and I just kind of devoured the books. And I actually taught a class. It was an ethics class where I let the students choose one of three books, and the first of the first of the Game of Thrones series, Ice and Fire series, was one of the books that they could choose. And I made them, if they wanted to choose that book, what they had to do was they had to find a character in the book and talk about their ethical choices in conversation with a number of different ethicists that we had covered in the class.
Mm-hmm.
So Ned Stark would be one of my favorite examples when it comes to this. I think what Ned Stark is really what I would say is a classic deontologist. So what do I mean by that? Basically, a deontologist would be someone who has this idea of right and wrong that Ned frames as honor, and he or she has to live up to that no matter what. Like even if like 1,000 people have to die for me to do the right thing, I'm going to do the right thing, right? And I think that's a very sort of chivalrous idea of what knighthood was.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
in the show opens with him, beheading a guy that escaped the Black to tell them that winter's coming.
But the rules are the rules, right? The rules are if you're a deserter from the Night's Watch, you get your head cut off. And the rules of Winterfell are if you pass a sentence, then you're the one that swings the sword. And Ned famously explains, our ways are the old ways. And so there's no wiggle room. If you want to be an honorable person, you have to live up to the standard that your fathers and your forefathers have done. Whereas someone like Varys is, I would say, much more along the lines of a consequentialist, where he's thinking, okay, I want the good of the realm. At least that's what we think he's thinking.
And he's the bald guy in the council. That's right. If the new season hasn't started yet, they haven't started the updated binge watch.
That's right. So Varys is someone that this classic moment at the end of Game of Thrones where Varys and Ned are talking about what the right thing to do is. And Varys is all about, hey, look, lie, cheat, steal, do whatever is good for the realm, because your individual honor just pales in comparison to the good of thousands of people. So anyway, I think it's an interesting ethical debate with those two characters.
It's in season 2, and he asks it to Tyrion. In a room sit 3 great men, a king, a priest, and a rich man with his gold. Between them stands a sellsword, a little man of common birth and of no great mind. Each of the great ones bids him to slay the other 2. Do it, says the king, for I am your lawful ruler. Do it, says the priest, for I command you in the name of the gods. Do it, says the rich man, and all this gold shall be yours. So tell me, who lives and who dies? And Tyrion's response is, depends on the sellsword. And Varys says, does it? And that's where he goes on and says, power lies where we think it lies.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you looked that up. So, I mean, number one, it's a great line. It's a great line, and it's debatable, right?
Oh yeah.
But it kind of gives a nice little window into the complexity of 2 really smart characters. And I think it helps to be smart when you're writing smart characters. I feel like sometimes I read, I'm supposed to believe a character is brilliant, but I'm not quite convinced by the character's actions or dialogue or whatever. but these are certainly two characters that are that really are believable as certifiable geniuses. And I think that the answer to the riddle was the power is wherever the people think the power is.
Yeah.
Right? So it's almost like an illusion. That power is the perception of power. I think that's what he's trying to convey.
So when your colleagues at a seminary found out you're writing a book about Game of Thrones, and some of them I'm sure watch it and some of them don't. For those that don't, and I'm sure the main thing they've heard is there's lots of nudity and killing and immoral things in it.
Yeah.
What's the explanation for not only the interest in it, but you're writing 2 books about it?
Well, it's interesting. Like I think, well, part of this was I had written, like in 2017 and 18, I published 4 books. So I had a lot of other, and I am the editor in chief of a journal. So I was doing enough academic stuff to be able to justify, wanting to do a side project. But even so, I did, I sat down with my academic dean and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this." And he said, "I got no problem with it." And my colleagues at United Theological Seminary are pretty cool and for the most part pretty nerdy. So I think that they totally were excited about the idea, and for the most part, I've been cheered on.
Mm-hmm. And when you so one of the things I really liked about the first volume is the way you introduce it, both in the way you introduce the concept of religion for those that may just be into Game of Thrones and are like, "Oh, this is cool, more Games of Thrones books," and in how you introduce George's understanding and experience of religion shaping his the creation of this universe and stuff. Can you kind of share how, as a scholar of religion, you begin to wrestle with the religions in Game of Thrones and then George's own wrestling and experience in religion?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think George is pretty outspoken about how he was raised Catholic, and there's sort of a lot of those typical American experiences of growing up Catholic are part of his experience. And I think knowing that and then approaching a medieval-ish world, a world that's supposed to kind of exist as a parallel universe in the medieval period, that I think it really actually benefited George that he had an understanding of how pervasive and ubiquitous religion would have been in that period. Not to say that his own Catholicism was all important, but for example, you're reading Tolkien and you really don't encounter religion. You encounter things that might start a religion, but if this was going to have a sense of realism to it, why isn't there like a shrine dedicated to Gandalf in the Shire? Or, where are the temples? Where are the religions in this world? And the answer is there really isn't. Mm-hmm. And I think that in Martin's world, because there is something along the lines of dragon magic or whatever, Martin has conceived of this world where if there is something that people perceive as a supernatural, they're going to try to explain it using the language of mythology. And that mythology won't just exist as mythology. It will actually turn into a system of worship. Mm-hmm. And so for Martin, the most dominant system of worship for a lot of the main characters is loosely based on Catholicism. It's the faith of the seven, and that's an entry point. I think overall, there's probably dozens of religions that Martin mentions for the world. So it's interesting. It's interesting to kind of see where these are coming from. Some of these have real world analogs, and Martin will call it out like this was clearly based on Zoroastrianism. And some are fictional. Some go to H.P. Lovecraft. Some are, pretty superficial. But that's it. It starts to be an interesting puzzle when you start putting it together.
Mm-hmm. So, what were a moment or insight or two that struck you and excited you when you started digging into this project? I'm sure when you said yes to it, you didn't really know what you were saying yes to. Yeah. And then you are, working on this book, with one of the, with Aaron, who is a hardcore Game of Thrones fan and podcaster. So like he's super into the fan community and has all the, like even some of the art is the Clegane Bowl, right? Like, so which still hasn't happened yet.
Well, we're hoping, we're praying, we're supplicating and whatnot.
I just feel like the sirens they play every time someone mentions it just went off. So Aaron's my co-author, and he's one of the guys over at the Bald Move podcast, and he's so he's kind of the Game of Thrones super fan. So the idea was that his knowledge of the world and knowledge of fan theories and whatnot, and the knowledge of the sort of the show's production, would maybe complement my expertise on religion or whatever. In reality, it was sort of a really complementary. I mean, he's really interested in religion, and I'm really interested in Game of Thrones. So it struck up a really great friendship, I think, and I hope it kind of flows over onto the page. I did not know what I was getting into when I first suggested the idea. But one thing that really struck me as interesting was the amount of the amount of Roman impact that went into creating the Faith of the Seven. So I think that on the surface, the Faith of the Seven looks to be somewhat based on Trinitarian Catholicism during the 1300s or whatever. So you've got this religious reformer, and you've got St. Francis characters, and you've got corrupt popes and whatnot. I think in reality, what the Faith of the Seven is it's an amalgam of various moments in the life of Roman religion that both predate Catholicism and postdate the Reformation. And it's almost as if the Roman idea, well, of course the Romans would have borrowed this from other ancient cultures, but the Roman idea of the seven luminaries, the planets that are visible to the naked eye at various moments during the year, the idea of the seven luminaries found its way into Mithras worship, found its way into different kinds of worship in Roman religion. And it's almost like, let's imagine that became the dominant force of gravity for Christianity. So instead of 3 aspects of God, now we have 7 aspects of God. And what would that look like going into, for instance, the one of the gods of the Faith of the Seven is the maiden. How would Mary veneration have fit into that paradigm? If indeed the 7 luminaries or the 7 hills of Rome. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism with the number 7, and I think what ends up happening is George is reimagining the development of Catholicism along those lines instead of the traditionally Trinitarian lines. Yeah, and what's funny to me is how, I mean, there are certain parts of what was in the book I had like observed when watching the show, but the show's so enticing that like you can be completely oblivious to just how big a role religion and stuff is playing throughout the show itself.
Right.
And I think it's similar to the way that, you know, unless someone points it out, you may not understand just the role it's playing in our global politics and all sorts of things.
That's right.
And
because it's beneath the surface, in many cases, it's beneath the surface. And even when it's not beneath the surface, it's people don't know how to talk about religion, or they're repulsed by it in a way that makes them kind of want to give it a short and superficial take. I mean, I think that this has been a big problem with this is just in general. I think that religious misunderstanding is a big problem for everyone, and it's becoming more of a problem as people's general interest in religion wanes.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how do you like when you think of the role Game of Thrones is playing culturally, right? Mm-hmm. Like when it comes back, you're going to have, 2 months where more people in the United States are sharing the same story at the same time than we have in a long time, right? Like maybe the Super Bowl, but the Super Bowl is like a one-time thing, not everyone here has probably watched all the episodes at least twice, and now we're all watching it at the same time and tweeting about it.
Yeah. I mean, at the very basic level, it's just a well-told story. There's lots of eye candy, right? Dragons and fire and amazingly expensive set pieces. So there's part of that. But I think that people are longing for stories that give them communal identity. I think that you see that with football team narratives. People form communities around sports. People form communities around politics. Game of Thrones is one of those narratives, like Tolkien or Star Trek or Star Wars or something like that people will form a community around the narrative, because there's something innate in the human experience that wants a tribe. Everyone wants a tribe, even if even introverts want a tribe. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to find that in traditional ways because our media has changed so much. The ways that we connect to our immediate family has changed so much. And Game of Thrones is something that happens to have a lot of cultural currency right now. In 10 years, maybe it'll be something else. But I do think that there is a big overlap between the way religions work and the way tribes work. Whether or not that tribe is formed around something with cultural currency or something that has a 2,000-year history.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think part of it is that humans are not very clear to themselves about what animates and motivates them and what inspires them and their anxieties and their fears and what you're going to do with the fact we're born to suffer and die and all that kind of stuff. And we get at it in stories or, listening to someone do music or art and things. And this story is different than a lot of them in fantasy, or definitely in pop culture, in that there is not like a clear hero throughout. There's not this clear salvation story, and there's like people sitting around betting on if there's even going to be humans surviving at the end. Like, and there's like a sick, twisted group that are like, I hope the Ice King wins. Like, so what do you think is the cultural anxiety or questions that maybe as a culture we don't know how to ask in the open, and so we've clung on to this narrative so much that like nerds have successfully witnessed the jocks to get into this show, and now they have.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. Well, I think that part of the human experience is wrestling with a feeling of powerlessness, and then at the same time wrestling with the ethical responsibility of whatever agency we do have. Mm-hmm. And I think that in at least contemporary America, I think that there is a massive disconnect or a cultural divide between the billionaires who are running things and the average person who, has very limited access to power. And I think that can create a number of elements of anxiety. And being less connected to your local priest or pastor is part of this, because it used to be that these guys had little fiefdoms. Like you actually are looking at divine power represented by this mediator that I can see every week. Well, there's been these folks have been demystified, and in many cases I think that's a great thing. But I think that in general, the human feeling of access to power at the highest levels has greatly diminished. And there's something about seeing what's happening in the throne room and seeing the machinations and the chess pieces moving around in really a show that the stakes are high, but they're fantasy. That kind of escape is really attractive, because you kind of have this vicarious access to power that you wouldn't have in reality. I think the same may be true for video games, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, I think one of the things that it gets at is that sense that we have greater awareness today of the problems facing us as a species, as a culture. It brings about a lot of anxiety, and we don't feel like we have significant agency to do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, climate change would be a great example of this. I mean, George has recently said, and you can believe him or not, but he has recently said that that the White Walkers do, in some sense, represent this massive climate change that's it's overtaking us, and we're preoccupied with who's going to win the Game of Thrones, but we don't see this massive threat right on the horizon, or at least we might see it and not know what to do about it, feel powerless against it. Now that may be George sort of getting ethical in retrospect, but there, it does work as an analogy. If we're just as a taking a reader response approach to it. It certainly does have an analog in our present context.
Yeah, and I think there is a sense that you have those two giant questions sitting there, where it's like, who's going to end up in charge, on the Iron Throne, and then what are you going to do about a bunch of like ice zombies coming at you? So like I had a friend who's very committed to the environmental crisis account of it, and he's like, and now once the whites got a dragon, that's like an unstoppable feedback loop in the ecosystem. And I'm like, I was like, one, we should avoid those, which I agree, and but I'm not sure that's how this works, but hey, if it inspires a a response from the United States of America to take the ecological crisis seriously, go for it. Kill more dragons.
One of the things that we talk about in the second volume is the analogs between dragon mythology and the way that dragons function in Eastern religions.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, Japanese religions, a lot of Eastern religions actually, where the dragon actually represents a change in the weather. So the idea was that if you had a drought, if you could get the dragon that sleeps underneath the water of the river or the water of the lake or something like that, if you could get the dragon to fly from the water to the heavens, you would be able to basically get these godlike creatures, divine creatures, to make it rain. And so in a lot of ancient dragon narratives, the dragons actually do represent a positive climate change, or a climate correction, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to take it too far. I think in many cases the dragons do mostly represent sort of the monsters of European imagination. But I think that there's, if you wanted to take that line of reasoning, that you live in a world where the winter could last for a generation and you need some kind of power to balance the seasons, a mythological appeal to the way dragons function in a lot of ancient cultures is an interesting, let's say, device. It's an interesting literary device if you did want to make that connection.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I find this stuff fascinating. I don't know if anyone else will.
Oh yeah. So one of the other things that come up in it, and it gets handled differently in the different kind of religious expressions, is incest and like human sacrifice. So
those are topics.
I know. So as a scholar of religion, when you start trying to decide what to do with incest and human sacrifice, what's underneath the surface of those questions?
That to me, that's really fascinating, and I really did lean on a lot of my colleagues who've done a study of the way that blood is viewed in many ancient cultures. So I have one colleague that says, and this is sort of a soundbite, but he says, look, all religion is about blood purity. Or at least it begins with the question of blood purity. And the idea here is that blood, human blood, animal blood, it contains the life force of the creature. And this is such a powerful, it's such a powerful element that is in most of life not visible to the human interaction. That when you do encounter it, it's really important that you establish a ritual so that you can encounter this kind of almost supernatural power, mm-hmm. Or preternatural power in a way that's ritually pure. So you create these rituals around the power that's infused in the animal's blood. And eventually, these rituals go into how we consume the animal, what we do with bodily fluids on a monthly cycle, all of these sort of rituals that govern our interaction with blood are crucial to maintaining the purity of the tribe. Now, when we get to sacrifice, in many ways, it's almost like an invitation. It's like, if you've ever stood around a barbecue and like enjoyed the smell of the meat as it cooks, well, the ancient, I don't know, have you ever done that?
Oh, I have. I'm just thinking of like the vegan that just wrecked their car. They're
Yeah.
like, ah.
Well, those vegans are aware that some people do stand around barbecue pits and enjoy the smell. And there's a reason why. There's a feeling of community. There's a feeling of community that's created, tribalism that's created by sharing a common meal. And ancient cultures believed that a lot of sky gods enjoyed that smell too. And they believed that what was happening with smoke is that you've got something about the essence of the animal that's now rising to the heavens in a form that can be consumed by the god. So you in other words, you got to invite the god to the meal. And I think that that's, in many cases, that is the impetus behind animal sacrifice. And then, of course, that becomes very ritualized as well, because you're dealing with something that's really powerful. You're dealing with a deity, right? So you need a ritual to keep it pure. Mm-hmm. And then if you want, I mean, I don't know what you want to say about the incest part of it. Maybe you can contribute to that part of the conversation.
Oh, I mean, I was just thinking that some of the shock moments of the show itself is how on the surface it's a different elements are so offensive to kind of contemporary ethical order, but then the different cultures and religions you discover there's ethical systems in play, and I think the sacrifice, like human sacrifice bit to the Melisandre's whatever you want to call, like ghost murder baby,
sure.
To the like regular the incest stuff in the Lannisters, that's creepy.
It is creepy, and I think that a lot of tribes would say it's creepy. Ancient tribes would say that. Although we should acknowledge that endogamy is practiced in a lot of ancient cultures and in modern cultures as well. And the idea with endogamy is that it actually is better for you to marry within the tribe. And so it means that you're probably related in some way, however distant, to someone in the tribe. And that's actually the best way forward. And we see that in the biblical narratives too, right? Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't sort of, in other words, there wasn't the same taboo. Let's imagine that Jon Snow is actually the nephew of Daenerys, right? And they end up getting together, and so he's really marrying his aunt. That's in ancient cultures. This is not a problem. This is not a problem. Now, because that's your reality, because the default position is endogamy, and so you're going to marry within the tribe, you're going to need to develop certain taboos about your brother or sister or mother or father. And so you see those taboos developing to get to provide some strictures around the default position of endogamy. And clearly the Targaryens have a different view on this than, let's say, the Starks. The Starks are going to be really repulsed by brothers and sisters marrying, and the Targaryens are going to fight it to the death. They're going to defend it with their lives.
Yeah, and in Martin's decision to postpone actually finishing the major story and releasing an entire new collection of histories, there's even more fights about incest, all in a giant decision delaying the finishing of the story. So I don't even know what to do with that. But when you think of the responses and stuff you've gotten from the book, like what are the responses where you're like, oh yeah, that's why I put all this effort into this?
Well, people look. These things are fun. We wanted them to be fun. We want to talk a little bit about the origins of animal sacrifice and whatnot, so we can get people's interest, pique their interest, and kind of package. I mean, in a sense, these books are a sneaky way to introduce comparative religion.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But we wanted to have fun with them. We wanted to live in the world a little bit longer. We thought fans would enjoy that experience as well. And so at the end of the day, we wanted to make sure that this was an enjoyable read. So we're having a lot of fun with making fun of the characters, or making fun of Martin, or making fun of ourselves. And we'll probably do that every other page or whatever. But in between, we're kind of sneak in a little bit of academic research just to keep people interested in the topic and what makes the world work. There's a lot of plot points in the books and in the show that make more sense if you understand how ancient worldviews worked, how ancient religions worked.
Mm-hmm. And what, maybe say a bit about how the War of the Roses framed a lot of Martin's thoughts about the book.
Yeah, I think that this actually is a key historical background for primarily the first novel.
Mm-hmm.
So, A Game of Thrones centers around this dispute between the Lannisters and the Starks, and there's a number of real world analogies between the Lancasters and the Yorks that we call in retrospect the War of the Roses. But a lot of the characters in that era of English history find literary types in at least the first novel of the book. So, for instance, Tyrion, who's almost everyone's favorite character, at least in the top three, looks to be modeled after Richard. And the reason why he's modeled after Richard is, number one, Martin has said he is modeled after Richard. But this is a character that has rumors going on around him because they say that his body is twisted, that he's got a crooked spine, and his limbs don't work quite the way that they should. And they believe, these Tudor historians believe, that Richard looks that way because he's been cursed by the gods. Mm-hmm. And so lots of bad things happen to him, including being accused of the disappearing of two young royal boys. Well, this is exactly what happens to Tyrion. His body's twisted. He believes he's hated by the gods. Which comes out more in the books than the show, and he's accused of trying to murder Bran Stark, and then he's accused of trying to murder King Joffrey. And in both cases, he's innocent. But what he's guilty of being is he's guilty of being a person with disability living in a world that misunderstands and overly theologizes disability. And I really do think that Martin is playing with the various problems that Richard would have had dealt with in the War of the Roses.
And when you one of the things y'all do throughout the book is, I mean, you're unpacking what goes on in the show and in the books around religion. You're also developing fan theories and things. And yes, one of the reasons I enjoy using kind of pop culture stuff from the nerd community and talking about religion is people are a lot better at permitting kind of hermeneutical freedom in nerd culture. And there's like this ongoing relationship between the creators and the fans that take the whole thing seriously, then impacting and shaping what the ongoing process of creation is. And in most religions, we cover up the fact that that's what happens.
Well, it's interesting to me because I think that there's some really interesting analogs, or really not, I should say, really interesting manifestations of how canons work. And first of all, let's acknowledge that somehow we've been able to rehabilitate the word nerd in ways that I would have not thought of in my childhood. You can actually have a legitimate amount of street cred in certain communities by being a super nerd. So that's interesting to me. But the thing about canons is interesting because if you are committed to a narrative, and we see this with Star Wars quite a bit, if you're committed to a narrative and you feel like someone has done violence to the narrative in a way that has ruined your experience of it, you will endeavor to get your people, you and yours, your tribe, to remove certain elements from the canon, right? So the prequels of Star Wars, in many people's minds, do not function as canon, even though the authorial, the authorial voice is the same as the original trilogy, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting canonical issue for me. It gets even more complex with Game of Thrones because what you have is this original narrative in the form of these first 3 novels that take place and get and spur enough fan appreciation for the canon that someone wants to create an adaptation for the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So the showrunners have what they've done with the author's permission. They have created an adaptation that's post-canonical to that really exists in parallel to the book canon, and in many cases, the fans have embraced both canons simultaneously now. So it's not like one is just fan fiction and one is
Mm-hmm.
canon, because what's happening is that the adaptation has now outstripped the original canon, because the HBO series is now far beyond the plot point of the most recent book, because
Right.
of George has stalled out on writing the books. So now we're not sure which is canon and which isn't. Both canons exist within this kind of multiverse situation where you might have some book purists, but they're few. Most people just simply accept these 2 parallel canons running side by side, one functioning originally as fan theory, but now functioning as original narrative. And I've never seen anything like it in my life, and I think it's fascinating.
Oh no, it is, and I mean even when you give like the Star Wars example of arguing about the canonical nature of the prequels,
right?
I mean, then you have a whole different group of people get upset that I mean, it may or may not correlate to it being predominantly female and women of color getting certain roles in the newest movies, but they've lost their biscuits over that on Twitter, guys, Star Wars fans. And then you had a whole, when Disney bought the Star Wars universe, they basically took a whole bunch of the fiction books that have been written in the Star Wars universe and said, those aren't canon. Only these things are. And now we're going to restart the books and the comic books and the video games, and our version of them are all canon. And it's
right.
it's a fascinating thing, because I think a lot of us, especially, Christians, just have their canonical texts sitting there, and the history of how it got there is not something they reflect on much.
No, right. And what we're seeing here is a lot of these decisions playing out in real time. So, for instance, if we're looking at a text that's, let's say we're looking at a text that's 600 years old, then we kind of shrug our shoulders and say, Well, this is in many ways going to reflect the biases of the time, right? We're going to expect the female voice to be absent or enclosed in the voice of the male, or we're going to expect a lack of complexity for female characters. And in many ways, that's just kind of par for the course when you're studying medieval history or medieval literature. But with Game of Thrones, we're seeing all of these decisions play out. We're seeing casting decisions happen before our eyes, and so now we're questioning. Well, this is a show that actually subverts a lot of the male-dominated narratives that we've come to. There's a lot of strong female characters, characters that are female characters that are very complex, very gray characters. And so Martin has established this subversion to a lot of medieval literature and a lot of fantasy literature, modern fantasy literature. So now our expectations for him are off the charts, because he claims to be a progressive. So we expect him to act like a progressive. Well, the reality is he was progressive in the early 90s when he started writing this, and that we should expect that he's going to struggle with all of the contradictions of a white guy living in the early 90s. And now we're seeing these play out with HBO casting decisions. And we're starting to question, okay, well, yes, this was a white guy in the book, and the book is the original canon, but aren't there more important things than canon? Right? Aren't these ideological agendas more important than quote unquote authenticity? Mm-hmm. And I really do think that those kinds of casting choices or narrative choices have to exist with the world of the audience. And they have to exist in that way because they simply have to continue to be relevant to the readers or to the viewers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think that's like, though, being clear that there's this ongoing process of receiving, reading, rereading, and then retelling going on in any type of nerd community is a good thing to put forward to religious communities who resist taking responsibility for that kind of contemporaneous enactment of their tradition, of their narratives. And there's a lot of times where, you point back to another point in church history, and that was where they were doing the exact same thing in their context, and that's your justification for not taking responsibility in your own. Right.
Yeah, no, it's one of these things. Primarily I do historical Jesus research, and it's become kind of a trope among liberals to cast Jesus as the prototypical progressive. Like, he was the first person to preach tolerance. He was the first person to preach racial inclusion. He was the first person to feed the poor. He's the first person to have women disciples. And the reality,
I actually think he caucused for Bernie. I don't know if
he was a Bernie guy. Yeah.
Yeah. There's multiple attestation.
Jesus felt the burn. That'll be my next book title. All right. So, but here's the reality: Jesus was probably was a progressive guy of his time. He wasn't the only one. I mean, a lot of these mandates to feed the poor, you find these all over the Hebrew Bible. You've got powerful women. You've got Salome of Alexandria, who's the queen of Israel before Jesus even came around. Israel had a queen of Israel 2,000 years before America has established the first female president. So there's a sense in which the world is so very complex that that even if we view Jesus as a progressive, number one, he's not the first progressive, and number two, he's a progressive man of his time. This is still the guy that tells the Syrophoenician woman that she is a dog by comparison.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're going to have to embrace, if we're going to embrace our own history including our own religion. We've got to embrace it with all of the warts of the realities of previous eras. And we should avoid being self-righteous, because future generations are going to judge us for things we can't even imagine.
And if they do, it's because we parented well. That's the thing. I always tell church leaders that are old and start complaining. I'm like, no, you've succeeded as grandparents. If your grandkids are like, how were you so ignorant and not as full of justice and love? Like, if you do that, that meant you did a good job. And I hope my grandkids think I'm backwards in things I have yet to examine.
I have a little bit more self-investment than that, but I think you're right. I think in general we want our children and grandchildren to be better people than we were, and sometimes I worry about the example we're setting. But this also comes back to the way we reimagine our histories, right? So with Game of Thrones, I think that there has been this myth told that of a lily white Europe, right? That doesn't take into account how prominent Asian culture was in the rise of the Eastern Church. The center of the universe is Constantinople, right? This is in a country, Turkey, that we now consider to exist both in Europe and in Asia, right? What continent is Israel in? It's in Asia. So, there are a number of wealthy African princes and kings that are well known throughout the European world. This idea of a totally lily white Europe without any influence from the outside is a myth. It's not. It's a fantasy that we've projected onto that period. And because we bought into the fantasy, any time that we might think about casting someone like Daenerys Targaryen as an Egyptian, for instance, instead of a blue blood aristocrat, you're going to get blowback because people don't imagine medieval Europe in that way. And so their sense of authenticity has been skewed by the default position of whiteness.
Yeah, no, it is and I think it's a little easier to help raise people's awareness of those issues when you're talking about the world of ice and fire, right? Like, one of the gifts good storytelling does is it creates a sandbox where you can learn about the awareness of power and oppression, interpretive creativity around different issues, all sorts of things. And you don't immediately have to, you can cultivate a certain interpretive virtues without immediately putting them in your life.
Well, that's right. And you can have heated debates on ground where the stakes are lower, right? So let's say, so the HBO is now casting for a spinoff, right? And so then the question is, okay, well, this is a spinoff. You get to create a narrative from scratch that plausibly fits within Martin's world. And now it's up to you, the showrunners, to show us that you can, that you can be culturally sensitive. At the same time, you're going to have to be faithful to the time period. You're going to have to tell a compelling story, but we're holding you accountable. And so people can have this fierce debate about whether or not a chief protagonist can represent a more Asian culture or not. Mm-hmm. And we can have that debate with Game of Thrones or the spinoff series in a way that helps us inform some of the higher stakes conversations in our lives.
Yeah.
Same thing with religion. I mean, the book that we wrote is about the religions of Martin's world, and maybe that's a safer place to introduce religion in many cases than than approaching some of the more fraught divisions in the real world.
Mm-hmm. So there are two other questions that I wanted to ask you, and one is how you see the role of science, rationality, and technology playing out in Game of Thrones, because that's one of the areas that what the Maesters, what's going on.
Right.
They're like the TV show's ahead of the books, but I wonder if you're thinking around questions around secularization and all that. Like how best to, like, how do you see all that playing?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, we don't want to push this too far, but in many cases, Martin's world is sort of a reimagination of a medieval period that's on the cusp of the modern period. And so you will have skeptics. And the Maesters, in a sense, sort of function as the foil for those. So if you create a whole season of Game of Thrones where most of the people in the world disbelieve anything that's magic, right? They don't believe about zombies beyond the wall. They don't believe that the dragons will ever return to the world, or maybe they didn't even exist. They don't believe in this fire god. The Faith of the Seven is just a mechanism to control the people. You've got a whole city of scholars called the Maesters, who are then positioned in every throne room in the kingdom and influencing the education of the children. What you have is sort of this default position of secularism that is going to be necessarily overturned, right? So the Maesters are going to get it wrong. They're going to be overly cautious of superstition, good for them, but they're going to appreciate the value of dragon magic or, the legend of the White Walkers. And eventually what the reader will do is the reader will start to identify with the Maesters in a sense, so that when the rebirth of dragons, which is something of a resurrection, the rebirth of dragons in the narrative is going to be shocking. It's going to be delightful, because there hasn't been a dragon on every page when you're reading through the first book. And I think that's sort of Martin's way of drawing the modern scientific mind into a world where there is magic, and at the same time allowing the magic to unfold in a way that thrills the reader.
No, I think that's important. And I've when I taught it with undergrad students, a number of them interpreted it as Martin's resistance to a kind of materialistic, deterministic, flattened universe where he's reintroducing the sacred, but not like claiming it under one religious tradition or spiritual reality. Yeah. It's just like, oh no, there are dragons, and you're gonna keep your head in the sand until a freaking White Walker lands in the middle of your court.
Right. I mean, that is something that Martin does well, is he brings in religious pluralism in a way that I haven't seen in any other fantasy literature at the scope that Martin does. And so it creates a lot of the cultural tensions between North and South and Westeros and Essos and things like that along religious conversational lines. And there is, there are apocalyptic figures. There are, in certain religions, there are, an eschatological hope. There is an eschatological hope for, the prince that was promised, or this Azor Ahai figure that's going to come back and save the world, or the second coming of this guy who's going to come back and save the world. And then, of course, if you're going to make that work, you're going to need a few people that doubt the whole thing, right? Because you want it to be thrilling to the reader when that kind of stuff actually comes to fruition.
Mm-hmm. So if you were in charge of how the final season's going to go.
Yeah.
What's your ideal plot points?
Okay. So I've really adopted this from my co-author. I thought it was kind of I didn't like the idea at the beginning, but he is convinced that we're going to see something along the lines of a proto-democracy that happens. So there's a lot of hints in the books that this could happen. The Night's Watch, the Night's Watch, and the Ironborn, and a number of tribes in Essos, they elect people democratically. So you've got the precedent set. Then on top of that, the Targaryens, Dany's ancestors, they have something along the lines of a democratically elected, something along the lines that, let's say, that we might find in Athens, where Aristotle's talking about representative government, not a fully realized modern democracy. And on top of that, there are several indications in the most recent season that the fact that Dany does not have an heir is a big problem, right? So Varys and Tyrion and Jon Snow are all involved in these conversations about what's going to happen with Dany's womb, right? Because Dany's womb is sort of the future of the kingdom, assuming that she wins the Game of Thrones. Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with a queen with a non-functional womb? Is this going to cause this kingdom to fall into disarray, or is there another way to choose the next leader? And so I think that would be a really interesting thing to do, not to come up with a full-blown representative democracy, but to come up with something like, a board of elders or something like that. It's something like an Arthurian round table that allows the actual Iron Throne to become not a seat of tyranny, but something that transforms the kingdom into something that's maybe the first baby steps toward a democratic system.
Like the dragons, like breathe and melt the Iron Throne into a round table.
Here's the problem. The dragons in many ways function as like nuclear weapons, right? They're the air attack. If you got one, you're the superpower. But unfortunately, they're not nuclear weapons that, they're wild beasts. And so what are you going to do with them? Right? It's going to be really difficult to figure out what's going to happen with these roaming, marauding fire beasts that can basically start a forest fire whenever they want, right?
Yeah. If they had a whole season called like After the Game, and Danny's just like trying to figure out how to feed them, and you're like, I don't want you to kill citizens.
Let me ask you, all right, so if assuming that someone does win the Game of Thrones, who wins the Game of Thrones?
I kind of am pulling for Sansa.
Yeah, sure.
And now I'm not optimistic. Tyrion would be cool as like the you weren't expecting it type of one, but I'm not optimistic that humanity's going to survive.
So you know that there are like Vegas odds on who wins the Game of Thrones, and Sansa actually has a pretty good. I mean, as far as Vegas, I don't know how they make these decisions, but she's actually got pretty great odds.
Oh, so there you go. I mean, I feel like she had this beautiful picture that her parents gave her. The Starks and Lannisters are going to get together. Joffrey ruined that, and then things just kept getting worse. So that if she's in power in some way, her own experience and suffering of the perverse shape of power will, would influence her rule in a way different than Dany, who has, didn't grow up with it and then can't even figure out what to do with the city after you overthrow, the masters and all that kind of thing. Sansa doesn't have a problem, isn't uncomfortable doing the day-to-day stuff, but also has the experiences that you could imagine her as a more just queen, like you would think her mom would have been.
Now, technically, Tyrion and Sansa are still married.
So I guess they could tag team.
I think, honestly, I would be shocked. I
just want Tyrion to ride the dragon at some point.
Well, he does know how to make fancy saddles.
I know. That's what I'm saying. He knows how to make saddles. We don't really know. Maybe he's got a little bit of dragon blood in him.
Yeah, right.
So that would be pretty gangster if there's this turning point and all of a sudden Tyrion's on a dragon coming out.
Now, Trip, it would be very, very much like Martin to kill Tyrion. I mean, he is everyone's favorite, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's what if it's the dragon just didn't even see him and landed on him? And
totally, yes. It could be a completely meaningless death.
It was oops. Kind of like in one of the fan Star Wars things where Chewie died by accidentally getting landed on. And
what? Is this in a fan fiction?
Yeah, well, they got rid of a whole bunch of books that were written between the movies, and Chewie died from a.
So it's like your dog got hit by a car.
Yeah, except your dog's the coolest character in the whole thing. Chewie's my favorite Star Wars character in general, and
he has the best lines, right?
Yeah, I want in episode 9, for Ben and Rey to get in a battle, and they're lightsabering it up, and you think Rey's about to die, and Ben's arm goes up, but then it keeps going up because Chewie just ripped it out of his socket.
Oh yeah,
and then he got Ben's hand with the lightsaber in it and just starts beating him, yelling Han, because he could say Han, and you think it's the lightsaber's going down on Rey, but it's actually Ben's arm, held by a Wookiee, just beating him. And Han.
I hate Wookiee. I hate all Wookiees. I'm an anti-Wookieite.
He has too much hair?
I think Chewbacca has no soul. I think Chewbacca is the real mastermind behind the Sith.
But in the Solo movie,
he should be shaven and walk through the streets like Cersei's walk of shame.
No, wonder how big Chewie is if you shaved him.
Right, he's 5'4" if you shave him.
You're oh, Yoda started out as a Wookiee.
Oh gosh. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this season wraps up. And it'll be interesting to see if Martin decides, oh, all right, that's how that plays out. I visualized how that plays out. Now I'm going to give my readers an alternative ending. That would be great. I think that'd be great.
I wouldn't be surprised if they went ahead and filmed 3 different endings, because I guess it's not like they can't sell all 3 of them, and then you do one now, and then the whole last episode's different when the book comes out.
I would love that. Because people have embraced sort of a dual canon. I'd like to see them really exploit it and see really play with the flexibility of these 2 different canons. in a way where you can kind of generate fan discussion on which was better. It would be really interesting to see the White Walkers win. See what happens.
And then, like, you put that whole, like, a 2-hour last episode in the theaters with a completely different ending than the show. And
that would be fantastic.
Like, on TV, they make us watch the White Walkers win, and we're all depressed tweeting about it. But then they're like, do you want the Dragons to win? Go to the movie theater and give us more money. And we're like, yes!
We would totally do that. We would, yes, we would. But honestly, in my heart of hearts, the thing that I care most about is what happens with the novels. So I'm curious to see what Martin does. He says that he's not going to be influenced, but it's clear that he does not have everything figured out. If he had everything figured out, he would have written these books. So, and a lot of these characters are already on different trajectories than they are in the show, in the books. So I can't wait. I do think that he will finish the books. If he does not finish the books, I think that they will be finished based on his notes and early writings, simply because there's millions of dollars at stake and there's contracts that have been written, right? Yeah. You think Bantam is going to forego the $500 million that they're going to make just because Martin dies? No. They're going to be written by someone.
Yeah, they've got to hand him a computer that automatically sends everything he does to Dropbox, and they're like, well, we don't get the password unless you die.
So you know what would be great? All right, let's imagine he does die. Cross our hearts, hope that he doesn't die. Let's imagine that he keels over tomorrow. What if they employed like 10 different prominent authors to all write an alternative ending? So you get like Stephen King, you get, you just get a number of these different authors, and now you have 10 different possible, it's like choose your own adventure at the end.
Oh, the hilarious thing would be if J.K. Rowling's had one.
Yes, absolutely. And she brought in all of the Harry Potter kids.
Yeah, and all of a sudden they're like, why do we want to settle this with death? Let's do it with a game of Quidditch. And
that would be fantastic.
And you're like, you can't ride your dragon. Use my Nimbus 2000.
Or have a character like Ron just like on page 2 be completely eaten by a dragon. That's it. That's all for Ron.
Yeah, no, they got to do that to Jar Jar Binks. Like
that would be great. Have Lucas write one of these.
Yeah. So so for people that don't listen to Bald Move, maybe tell them some of the stuff happening over at the podcast, the episodes you've been on, and what to expect going into the last season.
Yeah, Aaron and I have recorded, 3 or 4 podcasts related to this book we've written, and covering our favorite character. We've done a couple character studies, and we have done a 3-part review of Fire and Blood, which is Martin's latest book that sort of is the prehistory of Game of Thrones. So we have a few podcasts that promote our book, and a few podcasts that promote Martin's latest book, and of course the new baldmove.com. The new season of Game of Thrones is only 6 weeks away, and so Jim and Aaron are going to start up their coverage of the final season. You might hear me a little bit on that podcast, but definitely for Bald Move fans, you're going to want to hear the dulcet tones of Jim and Aaron covering your favorite show.
Oh yeah, when I I quit watching Game of Thrones after season 1 because I was so mad about Ned Stark dying.
Oh, you were one of those?
Yeah, and then I hear about season 2, and then in a day and a half I watched all of season 2, and I'm like, I guess. I guess I can do this. And then, of course, the moment season 3 came out, I'm like, all right, yeah, I love this shit.
I'm in. That was really the best. I think those were the best seasons, 2 and 3. 4 was pretty good too, but I mean that was really sort of prime meat and potatoes Game of Thrones. Those are great series of television.
Well, I feel like season 1 is that slow climb up to the top of a roller coaster. You don't even see the whole thing. Yeah. And 2 and 3 are like the craziness once it starts going. Yeah. And now you're like so enjoying the ride, but you can't like undo. Like there's no way you get back like the Red Wedding. Like that was first crazy. You're just
devastated. But you're sticking around even though you've been devastated because you're at this point you're kind of hooked. At least that's how I felt.
Yeah, I'm like I need one of these dogs not to die. I'm tired. Like you can kill all the people you want, but killing dogs is not cool.
You know, one of my friends told me that reading Game of Thrones is a little bit like knowing that there's going to be like a hammer to your forehead at any moment, and then realize like, oh no, someone's like cutting off my leg with a hacksaw. You know, you're expecting the hammer to the forehead, and then someone's actually creeping up behind you and like cutting off your leg instead. That's a little bit like what it is to read these books.
Oh yeah, I've told people it's like you're like it's so enjoyable, and then randomly someone jerks an ingrown hair out of your nose, and like your whole body convulses. It's like it was just sitting there, and and you're like, oh, ooh, and
you didn't see it coming. I told you I was going to do it 3 times, right?
Yeah, you're like, why? You're like, I shouldn't have trusted you, but I can't leave. I'm excited about it, and I enjoyed the first book. I just started reading the second one, and so if you are a Game of Thrones fan and a religion nerd, not getting the books is like a really sacred violation of,
Yeah, no, get the book. If you haven't read the books, Martin's books, start with the Game of Thrones. If you don't like it after 10 pages, then put it down. But it may be a really, really pleasurable read, even if you don't like fantasy literature.
And the audiobook's really good too.
Do you do audiobooks?
I like audiobooks, but I lived in LA for 10 years, so you get good at audiobooks.
Why? What's the connection between LA and audiobooks?
You drive an hour and a half every day, twice. So if you're in the car 3 hours and you like reading, you get really good at audiobooks.
Got it. No, I get that for sure.
Oh,
Well, this has been really fun, man. I'd love to talk Game of Thrones or religion anytime, man.
Oh yeah. We'll have to do the historical Jesus.
Yeah, maybe that's going to be a lot less fun. Let's be honest about that.
I don't know. I mean, like I've always wanted a historian, to demonstrate that he knew he was the second person of the Trinity.
Well, here's the thing. I think that a lot of historical Jesus scholarship is in many ways like Game of Thrones. You have a lot of the same cast of characters among biblical scholars and historical Jesus scholars that you find in the world. There's a lot of metaphorical incest that's going on, and you've got your favorite characters that are going to be dethroned, and people that are creating machinations behind your back. So it's a world of intrigue and violence, my friend.
Oh, I remember in my PhD program, I did a seminar that was, New Testament and systematic theology on like how on the historical Jesus and then the different way theologians use it. And I just remember one time, once I put together that like a one group dates Thomas really early, and then you get all these Gnostic sayings in, and then like all of a sudden they can de-apocalypticize Jesus, and he's supremely more compliant with like neoliberal bourgeois ethics. I was like,
to look a lot more like me, and I kind of like it if Jesus looks more like me. Right?
yeah, but I was sitting in class and was like, so basically like 30% of the academy dates this one thing earlier, and then now Jesus is a lot more American. Like I don't. I was like, how, like I read their books. I don't get why they're dating it early. And the professor, who's, seminar adjacent, that's what I was trying to explain it to me. I was like, yeah, but, like John the Baptist, apocalyptic, early church, definitely. And then you're like, and Jesus, no, wandering cynic sage, and says the kingdom of God's in a stick. Like that, I was like, I couldn't get it.
No, that's actually, I think that's a really compelling argument for an apocalyptic Jesus. Jesus has to make sense in between John the Baptist and someone like Paul. But oh my gosh, what are we doing? This is not what this conversation is supposed to be about.
Oh, well,
We've gone off the rails.
Well, look. I went off the rails, but it's a type of affirmation.
Okay.
Of the high quality nature of our conversation.
Well, can we at least just leave our listeners with the image of Chewie holding an arm that's been ripped out of its socket and beating someone else to death with it? I mean, I think we owe it to them to leave them with that image.
Yeah, so just close your eyes.
Man. Well, this has been a lot of fun, man. And you don't mind me throwing in a little plug for the book one more time?
No. Go for it.
So just, go to Amazon.com and look for Gods of Thrones. And Gods of Thrones, the subtitles, A Pilgrim's Guide to the Religions of Ice and Fire, Hubbard and Le Donne. And we designed it to be a fun read, and I hope that you find it to be a fun read.
Oh yeah.